basically you have the argument from order, which says that it looks like Matthew and Luke follow Mark's pericope order. The big problem with that is it's a reversible argument. You can turn it around and understand it just as easily the other way. The second argument was argument from Semitisms. It assumes that the inclusion of Semiticisms means that it's closer to the event, but there's actually no reason to agree with that. And then also it's just not true that Mark has more of these than Matthew or Luke. Argument from Christology. Supposedly Mark has lower Christology than Matthew or Luke. We saw a problem is that it assumes that low Christology was the original belief and that high Christology developed over time, but that's refuted by the Apostle Paul. And then just more fundamentally, Mark doesn't actually have a low Christology. And there's also some cherry picking going on because you can find examples where it looks like Matthew actually has the lower Christology if you buy into the sorts of reasons that they're giving for that. And you have the arguments from Mark's mistakes and Matthew's mistakes, and we saw this is basically a case of heads I win, tails you lose. It's just all gets interpreted as Markan priority no matter what. Argument from additions and omissions is basically the idea that there's certain stuff in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke that Mark certainly would have included if it had been available to him, but that assumes that Mark is trying to include all of the material that is available to him, and there's actually good reasons from Mark itself to think that he's not trying to include all of the information that he has in his gospel. And then you have the argument from editorial fatigue, which basically says you've got continuity errors in Matthew and Luke, which we could explain if they made a change to Mark's narrative and then forgot that they made that change and copied something in later on. First, I argue that we don't actually have to admit that there are these continuity errors in the first place. It's perfectly reasonable to make the narratives consistent. And then beyond that, the argument's also reversible. So if the case for Markan priority is not actually all that strong, I say let's reconsider the early church. The early church is absolutely unanimous that Matthew's the first gospel to be written. And when we look at the internal evidence, this is borne out most strongly in the argument from conflation, where it looks like Mark is blending Matthew and Luke together. The alternative to this is to say that Matthew and Luke somehow independently know to preserve opposite parts of Mark's narrative. You have the argument from the shorter ending of Mark that it doesn't seem likely that Mark would, if he's the first one writing, that he would fail to include the resurrection appearances of Jesus and thereby risk them never being recorded. And then lastly, you have the argument from basically Matthew's love of money and precise numbers, because he typically has those, but we've got a few instances where actually Mark has them instead. And if Matthew was dependent on Mark, this is material he would have loved to include in his own narrative. So that's kind of a briefish summary of my case for the priority of Matthew.